When you look back at one of the darkest chapters in modern history, the real question is not just what happened, it is how an entire society came to believe it. Because this did not happen overnight. It began in a country that had just lost a world war, where millions of people felt humiliated, the economy was collapsing, and everyday life had become a struggle for survival. In that chaos, people were no longer searching for complex solutions, they were searching for simple answers to explain their suffering. And that is exactly where everything began to change. In post-World War I Germany, fear and frustration created the perfect environment for extreme ideas to grow. Political instability made people desperate for direction, and in that vacuum, a powerful narrative started to form. One that focused not on fixing systems, but on blaming enemies. It was during this fragile moment that extremist movements gained momentum, including the rise of Adolf Hitler. What makes this period so important to understand is not only the history itself, but how quickly truth can be replaced by emotion, and how entire populations can be guided away from reality when fear becomes stronger than logic. It is important to understand that Jewish communities in Europe were not a threat to society. However, centuries-old prejudices and stereotypes already existed in parts of Europe long before the Nazi era. What changed during this period was the scale and intensity of propaganda. The Nazi regime systematically used media, speeches, education, and political messaging to reinforce the idea of an enemy within. Through repetition, emotional manipulation, and control of information, these ideas were presented in ways that made them appear believable, even though they were not based on reality. This is how propaganda works. It does not need truth to spread, it only needs repetition and emotional impact. As economic hardship deepened, blame became a political weapon. Instead of focusing on real policy solutions, extremist narratives offered scapegoats, directing public anger toward Jewish communities. In political psychology, this process is known as scapegoating, when a specific group is unfairly blamed for broader societal problems. Once this narrative takes hold, it becomes easier for people to accept increasingly extreme ideas because fear begins to replace critical thinking. Over time, propaganda also works to dehumanize the targeted group, stripping away empathy by portraying them as different, dangerous, or less than. This psychological shift is what makes large-scale discrimination and violence possible. What followed in history was not an overnight event, but a gradual escalation, from words to policies, and from policies to systematic persecution. Laws were introduced that isolated Jewish people from public life, restricting their rights, work, and freedom. Eventually, this escalation led to one of the most devastating atrocities in human history. The key lesson is not only about what happened, but about how it became possible. It shows how misinformation, when left unchecked, can evolve into real-world harm on an unimaginable scale. Understanding this history is not about revisiting the past for shock value. It is about recognizing patterns that still exist today. Modern societies still face propaganda, misinformation, and the tendency to blame groups for complex problems. The tools may have changed, especially with digital media, but the psychological mechanisms remain strikingly similar. That is why studying these events matters, not to repeat them, but to recognize early warning signs before ideas of hatred and division can grow again. What makes this chapter of history so important to study is not only what happened, but how ordinary systems and ordinary people were influenced step by step. One of the most powerful tools used during this period was repetition. When a message is repeated often enough, through newspapers, speeches, posters, and schools, it begins to feel familiar. And in human psychology, familiarity is often mistaken for truth. That is what makes propaganda so dangerous. It does not need to convince everyone instantly. It only needs to slowly shift perception over time. Another critical factor was emotional manipulation. Fear is one of the strongest human emotions, and during times of uncertainty, people become more likely to accept simple explanations, even false ones. Political messaging during this era exploited that vulnerability by presenting complex national problems as the fault of a single group. Once fear is activated, critical thinking weakens, and emotional reactions begin to replace rational judgment. At the same time, isolation played a major role. When a group is repeatedly portrayed as separate or different, it becomes easier for society to mentally distance itself from them. This psychological distance allows empathy to fade. Once empathy decreases, people become more accepting of policies that would normally seem unacceptable. This process does not happen overnight. It develops gradually through language, media, and social reinforcement. As this cycle continued, misinformation became normalized. Many people were not directly involved in creating harmful policies, but they were still influenced by the environment around them. This is one of the most important lessons history teaches us. Large-scale events are often not driven by one moment or one decision, but by a chain reaction of ideas, influence, and social pressure. When enough people accept a false narrative, even passively, it can shape the direction of an entire nation. Looking at this from a modern perspective, the relevance becomes even clearer. Today, information spreads faster than ever before. Social media, algorithms, and digital platforms can amplify both truth and misinformation within seconds. This makes media literacy more important than ever. Understanding how narratives are constructed, how emotions are triggered, and how bias spreads is no longer just a historical lesson, it is a survival skill in the modern information age. That is why studying history is not about dwelling on the past. It is about recognizing patterns in human behavior so they are not repeated in the future. When we understand how fear, propaganda, and repetition can influence entire societies, we become better equipped to question information, challenge assumptions, and resist manipulation. And that awareness is one of the strongest defenses any society can have. When we connect these historical patterns to the present day, the lesson becomes even more important. The tools of influence may have changed, but the psychology behind them remains the same. Instead of newspapers and posters, we now have social media feeds, recommendation algorithms, and viral content capable of spreading ideas globally within minutes. This speed makes it even more important to understand how information is shaped, because what spreads the fastest is not always what is most accurate. In today's world, repetition still plays a major role, but in a more subtle form. When people repeatedly encounter the same idea, opinion, or claim across multiple platforms, it begins to feel widely accepted, even if it has not been fully verified. Emotional content often performs better than factual content, which means anger, fear, and outrage tend to spread farther than calm analysis. This creates an environment where narratives can travel rapidly without being properly understood or questioned. Another major modern factor is algorithmic reinforcement. Online platforms are designed to show users content similar to what they already engage with. While this improves personalization, it can also create echo chambers, where people are repeatedly exposed to the same viewpoints and ideas. Over time, this can strengthen existing beliefs and reduce exposure to alternative perspectives. This does not automatically lead to harmful outcomes, but it demonstrates how easily perception can be shaped when information is filtered. That is why media literacy has become one of the most important skills of the modern era. The ability to pause, question sources, and analyze emotional framing is essential for navigating today's information landscape. Just as in history, the most powerful influence is often not force. It is repetition, emotion, and perceived consensus. When individuals understand this, they become less vulnerable to manipulation and more capable of forming independent judgments. Ultimately, the goal of studying history is not only to remember events, but to recognize patterns of human behavior that repeat across time. Societies rise and fall not only because of leaders or events, but because of how people respond to information, pressure, and belief systems. When fear overrides reason, or when repetition replaces truth, entire populations can be influenced in ways that seem unimaginable in hindsight. That is why awareness matters, not as a tool of fear, but as a safeguard for the future. If this video made you think more deeply about how history, propaganda, and human psychology really work, make sure to hit the like button. It helps educational content like this reach more people who need to see it. And if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because here we break down real stories from history in a way that helps you understand not only what happened, but how the world still works today. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think modern society is truly better at resisting propaganda, or are we still vulnerable in new ways through social media and the internet? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you found this video valuable, share it with someone who loves history or wants to understand the world on a deeper level. See you in the next video.